Introduction.
Yeah, go for it.
So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 9, I think it is, of Recession Rebellion in this, the century of April, as I heard it described yesterday, which I thought was a very good line. What we're going to be doing today, as always, it's Thursday, which means we're talking about innovation, and also that we are in the very capable hands of Mr. Martin Lucas. Martin, give us a quick intro.
So my name is Martin Lucas. I run Gap in the Matrix. So we're all about revenue growth and revenue protection, and we use psychology to improve sales, marketing, service, anything a customer touches, basically.
And I'm Phil. I run a business called Corporate Punk, which is all about helping other businesses to become more resilient, responsive, and innovative. So, as we always say, these Recession Rebellion sessions, they're not intended to give you all the answers, but what they are short, sharp sessions covering different topics each and every day. The idea here is to give you practical advice and takeaways, and to, in some sense, just get you thinking differently and hopefully energized so that you go ahead and have a productive day, and hopefully we've contributed something of use to that day. As we always say, these things are done in the spirit of trying to help. We don't in any respect charge for it. Any spreading of the word would be greatly appreciated, though. So we'll do some shout outs, I think, later on in this webinar for those who very kindly spread the word yesterday. But yes, if you could make sure that you continue to hit those share, those like buttons, that would be really appreciated, because we're trying to help as many people as we possibly can through this initiative. If you have questions throughout, you'll see in the comment box, just have to fire them to me, and we'll have some time for questions with Martin at the end of the session. So without further ado, Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Phil. So we've got a bunch of stuff to run through, so I'm going to try and do it as a very, very fast-paced session this morning. Our goal is mind hacks, so breaking free of the habit loop. And where we start with that is understanding what habits actually are. So if any of you remember how you learned how to tie your shoelaces, it was left over, right over, middle, left over, right over, middle. You got shown a bunch of times, you tried it, you messed it up, you got it right, you tried it again, you messed it up, then you started getting it right. And what basically happens is that you learn that as a behavior, and you try it enough times, and then it goes into the system as a habit. And the way that the habit loop works is that you've then, once that's in your system as a habit, you've then got a setup of how habits are engaged, created, and then activated within the brain. So it works like this. You've got trigger, routine, reward. So your trigger might be 10:15 in the morning, back in the days when we used to work in offices, if you can remember yesteryear. Your friend might walk into the same floor as you, and that's your trigger. So you get up and you go to make yourself a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and then your reward is actually sitting down with your friend to have that cup of tea or cup of coffee, right? That's how simple the habit loop actually is. So in the same way we were talking about tying your shoelaces, you go to put on your shoes, the brain activates the habit loop of left over, right over, middle, right? And the thing about these habits is that it's not just the practical side of it. We have absolutely millions of them. And if you've been with us from the start, the thing that I love speaking to people about, and I love repeating it over and over, is that we've got this thing within the brain that I call the efficiency trick, meaning that the brain's job is to automate as much of your thinking and as much of your habits as possible. That's its job at the end of the day. So these millions of habits that we've got are all about keeping us busy and making sure that we get through life by doing the least amount of thinking as possible. And some of these habits are good. So if you think about running, so you've got a trigger, so you put on your running shoes. Your routine is that you go for the run, and the actual reward that you get is endorphins. You get that feeling, you get that rush of chemical release. And running is the same as eating an amazing piece of cake in terms of the chemical releases that you're getting within the system. Slightly different chemicals, but similar types of rewards. And that's the tricky thing about habits, because we've got millions of different ones, and some of them are good for us, and some of them are actually designed for us. So back in the day, Pecks Eden was the leading toothpaste in the United States when toothpaste became a thing, which was, roughly speaking, was just over a century ago. But what was happening with Pepsodent was that they were doing all this commercial testing, and what was happening was that the feedback from consumers was that they really liked the product, but there was no repeat use of it. And this was the same problem that all the toothpaste brands that were having. So they knew that the one that was going to solve this was the one that was going to become the number one leading brand of the day. And what Pepsodent did was that they added a taste to it. And because they added a taste to it, it adds a memory and a sensory association, which is a huge part of our habits. So if you think about any time that you're being triggered at the moment, like at the moment, there's some beautiful smells out in nature because we're coming into spring and moving into summer. So it means that, you know, there's lots of blossoming going on. There's a ton of different memories coming with that kind of sensory association, which is making it difficult for all of us because we can't go and do the normal things that we might do in the spring out in nature, right? Because we can only exercise once a day, if that at all. So Pecks Eden added that to it. And other times you need to look at different types of habits that you get and rewards that are coming in the modern age. So Febreze is another example in the consumer sense that they got to a point where they were about to can the product. So there's millions of dollars that go into R&D every single year, and tons of products like Febreze that never see the light of day because the testing doesn't allow them to do it. And what happened with this one was quite similar to the Pecks Eden, was that they were getting amazing feedback, but the reason they were going to can the product is nobody was doing repeat usage. And then right at the last minute, one of the researchers spotted that there was a lady that when she finished cleaning her bedroom, her reward was to spray Febreze. And up until that point, Febreze had no smell whatsoever. It eliminated odor, but it doesn't need smell to do that. So they added what I think is probably the most potent smell of any product on the market. And that's how Febreze won. Because what they understood was that there was a habit loop going on for people. So their reward was to spray the Febreze, and that smell became the sensory association. So I've done something good, I've cleaned, I've finished doing a task, I'm getting rid of something, here's my actual reward for it. And we humans are very addictive creatures, right? So when we lock in our habits, most of them are to do with the reward, and the brain's job is to automate your habits as much as possible so it does not like change. So anytime, like I was talking earlier, or the example that we've got here, is that anytime that you say, right, for my morning tea break that I have with my friend back in yesteryearland, right? Anytime that I have that, I'm just letting somebody into the call, can't do two things at once. Anytime that you change something, so you might say, right, normally with my cup of tea and cup of coffee, I have a muffin, and what I'm going to do to change that is I'm going to start having an apple. And I think it's pretty fair to admit that we've all tried something like that, and it generally goes like this. So the first day you have an apple, the second day you have a muffin, the third day you have an apple, and then you're back to having a muffin every single day. And the reason for doing that is that the brain has no feelings about good, bad. I'm not talking about ethics, but in terms of habitual behavior, the brain just does what it's used to doing. And if you try and get it to change just that simple thing, the reason why change is hard is that the brain resists it. So you have to have a lot of discipline, and you have to understand that even the simplest little change that you're doing, you have to be firm about it. If you tell the brain, literally, if you tell the brain that this is something that I'm going to do, that you've got no choice, and you keep at it and you keep wanting to change it, then eventually it's going to change. But change can be quite hard to do, but it's worth it. And here's the reason why it's worth it. Because, one second, sorry, again, technical challenge. Talking is a habit. So when I say that the practical side is very true, right? So in terms of how you tie your shoelaces and all those different things that come into your system, that's actually true about a lot of our feelings and a lot of our behaviors and also our thinking. Thinking is a habit. It's just a pattern of how you do things. So if you think about any time that you may or may not have had an argument with your partner, how often do you just go into pulling out the same things that you've said before, and they're saying the same things that you said before? It's a habit loop. So our talking is a habit. Listening is a habit. So I've trained over 5,000 salespeople. It's one of my previous businesses. And it was the number one thing that I was always pulling people up on, to understand that we get into a pattern of thinking and we hear what we think we want to hear. We hear what we think people are saying. We don't actually listen to people because we get into a habit of doing it. So when you have lots of repetition in your job or in your life, the brain's going to automate much of it as much of it as possible, because that's its job. It wants to use up as little energy as possible. So unless you challenge yourself, you're only going to listen to the part that you think is being said and the part that you think that you need to listen to. But it's not, all is not lost, because what you've also got is lots of opportunity. Because how you think is a habit, we spoke about that. And free thinking is a habit. And what's the difference between the two? So you've got an habitual set of thinking habits going on inside your brain all day, every single day. If you challenge yourself about how you're thinking, then you can break free of all of this. Because even though I said that change is hard, that's only a perception to most people. That's what I always challenge people on, because change is actually quite easy But it's all about how you put yourself forward to think about it. So here's my 3 tips for you. You've got to identify the trigger. Friend walks into the office, you get up a cup of tea, right? The friend is the trigger in that case. It's all about understanding what those triggers are, because talking is just as automated as listening, as tying your shoelaces. And it's a bit scary, right? Because I'm talking about the vast majority of the speaking and the interactions that you do every day is automated, because that's the brain's job. It wants to automate as much as possible. And the brain's not thinking about whether this is good for you or whether it's bad for you. It's just doing it based on the triggers that come to it. So here's the question to ask. This comes from psychoanalysis and some of the world's best coaches. A great question to ask is, does this serve me? So when you identify a trigger, it's not about saying that you have to change a million things. It's just about understanding, here's the trigger, then asking the question, does this serve me? Meaning, is there a different way or a better way to do it? And is it actually helping me as an individual? It's a great question to ask about all kinds of different things. And then the third part is that you now have the golden nugget of self-awareness. This is the thing that people spend years and years trying to figure out. And the golden nugget is simple: choice. The advice that I always give to people is not everything is about change. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you have to examine everything about your soul and your being and your mind and change everything, but it is about understanding what you want to change. And that's the upside of awareness, because if you can understand the trigger, you can ask yourself a good question about whether it's the right thing to be doing and whether it helps you or not. Then you've got the awareness to make a choice about whether you want to change something or whether you don't. Not all change is bad, not all habits are bad, but that's just a quick run through of different things that you can do with habits. Over to any questions. Any thoughts from you, Phil?
I think, so a question from me, Martin. I mean, I think many people at the moment are really struggling with habits in the context that they've had a very big life change almost imposed on them, right?
Yeah.
To challenge existing habits, but also create new ones. So what would be a sort of really practical way into thinking through, habits at the moment around things like working from home, or around, interacting with other people? What the practical habits that you would recommend at the moment?
I've got one that I think sort of answers the question. You can be the judge of that. One of the things that people are struggling with at the moment, if they're used to commuting into a city or a town or traveling or whatever that looks like, just going into an office each day, is that you need to ask yourself a question that will help you with stress, which is, where does your energy come from? And what I mean by that is that when you feel the need to recharge, do you enjoy hanging out with people socially, or do you enjoy time on your own and having a break? And that's actually introvert versus extrovert. So the introvert component of you is the types of people like me that actually enjoys time on their own, and that's how I process things. So even though I'm working from home, what I'm actually used to doing is going into London every day and then bobbing about and having lots of different meetings with team, with clients, with prospects, all that kind of stuff. So it means that in between all those meetings and the hour and a half travel that I've got a good probably 4 or 5 hours on my own every single day. And I have a lovely relationship with my wife, don't get me wrong, but what's different for me is that I've had to say, well, I'm around somebody all the time now. So I'm interacting on meetings, and when I'm not on meetings, I'm having a quick chat with my wife and things like that. So I'm not getting the actual, ironically, the isolation that comes from the title of self-isolation, right? So it's really good to be aware of whether, if you flip that around, is that extroverts need a lot of social interaction. That's where their energy comes from. So you need to ask yourself a question: is what's stressing you out at the moment? And my guess is that for a lot of people, it's going to be one or other things. So for me personally, what I've just started doing is just taking more time to myself, re-engage some hobbies that I've got, and just helping myself digest by having a little bit of time on my own. So that's a kind of habitual one, but much more about the core of who you are as a person between introvert and extrovert.
It's a great point, and I really like the idea that I really like that point about we're supposed to be self-isolating, and the one thing that most people have in common is they don't actually have any time for self-isolation, which I sort of recognise. Anyway, so we have a few questions here from the audience. I'm going to pick them up in a random order now. I'll start with a brilliant question, actually, which is quite meta. in your opinion, is there a tipping point when examining choices goes into being an unhelpful habit? And what does that tipping point look like?
So we'll actually be doing this in future mind hacks as more of a deep dive, right? But I think this question is actually about worry. I think that's what sits behind that question, right? So because if we examine our habits too much, but we're not actually changing them, all that we're actually doing is beating ourselves up. And it's such a common human behavior, right? The idea that we can ever actually think in the present is one of the most difficult things to ever do, because most of us are either thinking in the past and beating ourselves up for past things that we haven't done, or a past perception that we have of ourselves because of how other people have treated us, or we're thinking too much in the future where we're worrying about the unknown and things that we can't control. That's where I see the biggest amount of waste of people putting loads of energy into something that they can't change, because you can't change the past, you can't change the future. The only thing that you can say, and I've tried to live my whole life like this, and it's difficult, is not to have regrets about the past and not to worry about the future, because the only way that I can change the past and control the future is what I do right now. And that's less about habits. It's more just about what am I going to do today? What am I going to achieve? Which I guess is positive mind control anyway. But hopefully that answers the question, Phil.
I've read before, next question, that people have a finite amount of willpower which is replenished by sleep. Is there any truth in this? If so, are there advantages to changing habits in the morning? Is there a good time to intentionally attempt a change?
Yeah, so there's a really good book called Scarcity by a couple of psychologists, and it's a really good one to read. It's not about sleep in itself, but the scarcity principle is super interesting. When we feel robbed of something in the mind, so for me, like I spent 4 years working on the development of understanding decision making, right, which meant I had no income for 4 years. So my scarcity principle was about not having money, and I became very aware of not having money. So that when I moved to making the business commercial, I put more thinking into the money side and actually caused myself more problems because you're thinking about it. It's the same thing to do with anything to do with stress or pressure, or at the moment, if you think about what's stressing you out, is the idea that you can't do something, right? So probably this Easter weekend, my wife and I were going to go to, I think we were going to go to France the week after Easter. But for the Easter weekend, we were just going to chill out, get some nice food, do all that kind of stuff, right? That's exactly what we're going to do this weekend. And yet there's going to be a little minutia in our brains to do with scarcity, which always bothers me more than it bothers my wife, which is I'm not allowed to do the things that I want to do. That's an example of the scarcity. Moving on to the sleep thing is that it depends on who and how you are as a person, but absolutely the thing that I've learned, and I'm a huge believer of, and I've read it in a ton of different places, and some people think it's a little bit weird, but I still believe in this, that it's just a practical science of the mind, is that what you put into your mind as you go to sleep is all going to affect how you wake up the next day. So I'm always lying there thinking, I'm digesting the day, but then I'm thinking about positive things. I'm thinking about problems that I've got going on in terms of positive solutions that I want for clients. And I'm thinking about how I can wake up happy. And that's what I do. And as Phil will know, I've joked many times about this super early recession rebellion. I'm not necessarily a morning person, but over time, I've trained myself. So now I get up at 7 a.m. My wife and I go for a run every single day, which is helping us in the moment. So I'm much more positive with how I actually wake up. Whereas in the past, for many, many years, if not my whole lifetime, I wasn't positive about it. So how you sleep absolutely can make a difference. I'm a believer that you need at least 9 hours of sleep, and I've trained myself. I've got a very active mind. I've trained myself how to switch myself off and how to get into those types of deeper sleeps as well.
If I had my way, as Martin will tell you, I would have had these recession rebellion webinars about 6 a.m. each day. So consider yourselves all very lucky. The fact that Martin did not want to be doing a much earlier session than 9 o'clock, to the point about getting up in the morning. And we have time, I think, for one or two more. So there's a couple of related questions here. Let me just quite entertaining. I'll give you them both together, Martin. What are Martin's best 3 habits that he has developed in the last year or month? And out of interest, which regular habits have you found the hardest to change, and what practical technique helped you to change this?
So the best habit is positive thinking. So I think that this idea of positive thinking gets misunderstood by how people interpret things like the Secret and stuff like that. But I believe the godfather of positive thinking was Napoleon Hill. So if you read Think and Grow Rich, what he's really actually training you with is positive thinking habits. So that's been one that I've been working on for years. One of my best friends and I work on it. He's an absolute master of it, so I interact about that. I've also got a lady that I know incredibly well that works for me on the business, and one of the world's best coaches, in my opinion, Noelle Dye. You could look her up, Noelle, D-Y-E. And what we work on is getting rid of what I call mind junk. So that's one of the best habits that I've come across, is like when I ask myself, does this serve me? Because I've been working on this for 5 years since I started working on the decision making. I guess I haven't explained that, but one of the upsides for me was exploring all the awareness of self. So I've become, I wouldn't say you become more self-aware, you just become better at understanding why you're doing different things. So I've taken that does this serve me habit much deeper, where what I'm constantly looking for is the Freud stuff, because Freud always talked that there was an origin of something. And that's one of the deep mind things that I'm always working on, is not why do I do something, but what's the origin of doing it. And that takes me on to the other thing about difficult habits, is that ever since childhood, I've had bad eating habits, right? So within my reward system, and we humans are very addictive creatures, so we're looking for chemical releases for things. I've always been crisps and candy and stuff like that. And I'm 42 years old, and it's still an up and down battle for me. And I understand the origin of it and why it happens, but I find changing it really difficult. And that takes me on to the third best habit that I've come across. I did investigation of psychiatry, tons of different psychology, psychoanalysis. I tried all those different things. The best thing that I've found is hypnotherapy. And the reason why is that if you find a really good hypnotist, is what they're basically doing is going into the subconscious and rewiring things and stopping thinking patterns. So that would be my good and bad habit stuff, Phil.
I think that's all very helpful. Mine, slightly more prosaically, actually, has always been about making sure I make time for fitness and exercise, which I prefer not to do that. And I've been a great believer sometimes that if you create change by leverage. So for me, it's very hard at the moment, right? But part of the way I've been able to create change in my life is simply through the act of having to pay somebody to do fitness with me twice a week, a trainer. And I actually find that leverage, which is the paying of the money for somebody to do it, actually to be a very helpful, almost like structural discipline. Because otherwise what happens is I'm sending a very, very expensive text message going, no, I can't make the session tomorrow, which is a disincentive. So weirdly, I think it's also why people sometimes pay coaches and things like that, is we actually, the process of giving away money to something, actually giving something that matters to us, actually therefore gives us an incentive at the same time to follow through on commitments and to follow through on promises that we make to ourselves and to others. So it's not the solution to everything, but certainly for me, at a slightly more prosaic level around stuff like health and fitness, I've actually found it good to engage some support in that space. So we're all about the Joe Wicks in this household at the moment. And that's our sort of habit we're trying to create, is doing that 5 times a week as well. If you've not seen his stuff, it's a fantastic lesson, actually, reaping what you sow, Joe Wicks. You spend years and years building a social following, trying to find ways of getting kids into exercise, polishing up his presenting style and everything else, and then, come the hour, come the man kind of thing. So I'll talk more about that in a future session. So I think that's all we've got time for today. And Martin, thank you. That was a really stimulating beginning to certainly to my Thursday, and I hope to everybody else's as well. So we now take a break for the Easter weekend, where we're all going to go off and eat lots of Lindt buddies. Maybe that's just me. And we will be back on Tuesday. On Tuesday, I'm going to be diving a little bit deeper into those 7 magnificent questions that I shared with you in our session this Tuesday, and starting to give you some additional things to think about, some additional ways into answering those magnificent 7, which you can also find on LinkedIn. We put them up there later on Tuesday after this session earlier this week. So that'll be Tuesday. Very excited about that. Thank you as always for coming. Share, and I kiss your face. And have a wonderful, wonderful Easter weekend. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.